Hi, Chris. I'm starting with the nihilism and how it's different from moral nihilism. Well, the metaphysical nihilism and how it's different from moral nihilism. So, metaphysical nihilism is dumb and weird, and it's the opposite of not only metaphysical monism, but also Western individual metaphysics. So, where monism claims that everything is one object, and Western individual claims that everything is an individual object, metaphysical nihilism claims that everything is nothing. It's weird and it doesn't really make sense, but some people believe it. It's not that absolutely nothing exists, it's that concrete objects don't exist, only abstract objects. And Thomas Baldwin argued for metaphysical nihilism using this argument. Premise 1, there could have been finitely many things. Premise 2, for each thing, that thing might not have existed. And premise 3, the removal of one thing does not necessitate the introduction of another. Premise 4, therefore there could have been no things at all. So, regardless of your opinion on this argument, I have a few. You have to admit it's an argument and you can make the argument. Essentially, metaphysical nihilism uses the ontological argument for God, but flips it around and uses it for metaphysical nihilism. I can envision a world that concrete things don't exist in, so that world must exist and it must be the right one. It has the same problems that the ontological argument has, but I'm not here to take the argument itself apart. I'm just here to show the main difference between metaphysical nihilism and moral nihilism. The two are only similar in name, and I guess the belief that nothing exists in the field they deal with. Metaphysical nihilism, like I just explained, is the idea that nothing concrete exists, only abstract things, while moral nihilism, on the other hand, is the belief that nothing is truly morally wrong or right. So Larry can eat a person's arm, and the moral nihilist won't claim that that's a bad thing. They won't claim it's good either, which is the main distinction between moral nihilism and moral relativism. Moral relativism is the idea that everything can be morally good or bad, depending on the person performing the act's personal belief. Moral nihilism is mainly supported by the argument from queerness, an argument created by J.L. Mackie. This argument claims that if objective moral values did exist, they'd be really weird, completely different than anything else in the universe. But, he says, the morals that we have aren't completely different, so they must not be objective. Moral nihilism is completely different than metaphysical nihilism, mainly because they deal with completely different things, but also moral nihilism has a decent argument for it, while metaphysical nihilism doesn't at all. So, what is eternalism, and what are some arguments for it? This is the second question. Eternalism is kind of weird. Where the other two views of time don't have a set-in-stone future, eternalism does. For presentism, only the present, not the future or past, truly exist, and growing block theory claims that the past and the present exist, but not the future. So, taking those two and comparing them to eternalism, which claims that all three, past, present, and future, are real and do truly exist, eternalism is the direct opposer to presentism and interacts most with it. So I'll be focusing mainly on the arguments involving presentism and eternalism. So the main argument for eternalism involves Einstein's special and general theories of relativity. This is mainly because, as quantum philosopher Dean Rickles states, the consensus among philosophers seems to be that special and general relativity are incompatible with presentism. He says this because, according to the theories of relativity, the present can't be the exact same for everyone in the universe, making the present itself problematic. This is because relativity proves that the present is relative, which is why it's called relativity. So if Rob is moving at light speed, time is moving slower for him than it is for Steve, who's stuck on Earth. So if the present is problematic thanks to relativity, then the reaction is to search for a theory of time that can work with relativity. And eternalism is that theory. Because it claims that the past, present, and future all exist and are set, the theory of relativity's problem with the present isn't important. Rob and Steve aren't in the same present moment, but that's not a problem because the future and past exist simultaneously. So, yeah, I've made an argument for eternalism, but I'm not exactly convinced by the theory. It just seems too deterministic for a libertarian free willer like me. And if the future exists, then how am I supposed to have free will because it already exists? So if the future doesn't exist, in a theory like growing block theory, then the world isn't determined. But if the future does exist, then the world seems to be predetermined. I like the idea, and I like how it works well with relativity, but it's still very problematic. So, what are the main metaphysical elements of Berkeley's idealism? How is Berkeley's idealism compatible with realism, and am I convinced by it? Berkeley. So his idealism is different than the other versions of idealism, mainly because God is so connected to the theory. He explains it in his book Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, saying, this is kind of a long quote, so sorry, but it explains everything really well. It is evident to anyone who takes a survey of the objects of human knowledge that they are either ideas actually imprinted on the senses, or else such as are perceived by attending to the passions and operations of the mind, or lastly ideas formed by help of memory and imagination, either compounding, dividing, or barely representing those originally perceived in the aforesaid ways. By sight, I have the ideas of light and colors with their several degrees and variations. By touch, I perceive, for example, hard and soft, heat and cold, motion and resistance, and all of these more and less either as to quantity or degree. Smelling furnishes me with odors, the palate with tastes, and hearing conveys sound to the mind in all their variety of tone and composition. And as several of these are observed to accompany each other, they come to be marked by one name, and so to be reputed as one thing. Thus, for example, a certain color, taste, smell, figure, and consistence, having been observed to go together, are accounted one distinct thing, thus signified by the name apple. Other collections of ideas constitute a stone, a tree, a book, and the like sensible things, which, as they are pleasing or disagreeable, excite the passions of love, hatred, joy, grief, and so forth. So, essentially, Berkeley claims that every physical object that we see is entirely made up of concepts and ideas. So, the stone he mentions is made up of the properties of roundness, hardness, etc. This thing is round, cylindrical. It has those properties. So this is that's normal for idealism, the concept that everything is made up of properties, which Berkeley didn't really come up with that, and that's just part of his idealism. That's not the main part. So Berkeleyanism, it only really gets weird when he introduces God. So for Berkeley, everything is a part of the mind of God. For humans, we're just a very detailed thought in the mind of God. And so, yeah, it's a little weird. So, I think that Berkeleyanism is incompatible with realism. Peter Van Inwagen defines realism as objects that are in no sense mental, that not everything that exists or occurs within the mind. So, comparing this to the quote I used a minute ago where Berkeley explains his idealism, they're in opposition. Realism claims that external objects are real, where Berkeley claims that not only is everything mental, everything is a part of God's mind. For Berkeley, physical external objects aren't real, and external mental objects aren't truly real either, although Berkeley would try to disagree. If everything is part of God's mind, then nothing is external, because everything is contained in his mind. I'm not convinced by Berkeley's idealism, mainly because I don't like the false sense of free will it offers. God gives us all of our senses. He's done it all of our lives, essentially training us to respond in whatever way he wants us to. So it really just is a false sense of free will, because it seems like we're acting on our own what we want to do, but because he's trained us to do whatever he wants us to do, feeding us all of these senses, he knows exactly how we'll respond because he's trained us to do it, and so he can feed us exactly what he wants to in order for us to respond the way he wants us to. So I dislike that part of it, which just the free will part, and I also dislike the natural complicatedness of his idealism. So if he were to claim just that physical external objects didn't exist, I'd be more convinced, because I'm willing to be a little bit okay with that. But he chooses to come up with like this weird Spinoza-like giant brain god with everything involved in it. I also think that Occam's razor rings true when it comes to idealism, especially Berkeley's. If it's simpler, generally it's just the best solution. I don't know. So what is so far my favorite story from Story of Your Life and Others? And what is the main metaphysical issue that has captured my attention in that story? So this one's a hard one. It's a hard choice between Hell is the Absence of God, Story of Your Life, and Liking What You See, because I really liked all of those stories. and they all had a lot of different things that are fun to talk about. But I think I'm gonna go with Hell is the Absence of God, mostly just because it provoked more of a response in me than any of the other ones. The story is essentially the story of Job, but without the good ending. Job and Neil, the main character of Hell is the Absence of God, both meet God and have this sort of revelation kind of experience, and they both come out changed, and they both come out understanding a little bit more about God and loving God more. But where Job receives kind of his old life back, obviously not his dead kids don't come back to life, but he has different kids and he gets a bunch of money and whatever. Neil doesn't get any of that. He just goes to hell and spends eternity in pain. The God in the story in Hell is the Absence of God isn't just at all, and that seems to be the main metaphysical question of the story. I mean, obviously we have like absolute proof of supernatural beings in the story because there are angels coming down out of the sky and you can see people in hell. But the supernatural beings aren't good. They're bad, and they generally cause more pain than they cause good things. And the story kind of leaves me irritated, mainly because the God isn't just and seems to just take advantage of his power and use it to torment people. When Neil is shafted by heaven's light, he ceases to be Neil. He loses his free will and is taken over by this unjust, power-hungry God. So no matter what is argued against this point, I just don't think that I would be persuaded, because Neil goes through such a dramatic shift in his mindset that it's not reasonable to think that he's still the same person. He loves God even when he's in hell, and God has turned his back on him, and I don't know, it seems like his free will is just removed from him when he sees heaven's light, and it seems like the same thing happens with all of the other people. I talked about it in class, so you know what I think about it. I really like that story, so I just didn't really like the ending at all. So that's pretty much it.